Okay, part 2 of chapter 1, we're going to get to some more conceptual concepts here. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the constructs, some of the nature of finance and making decisions, and how that plays a part with respect to running businesses. So the first thing we want to talk about is something called the goals. And I don't really like the word goal. I don't think it fits totally. I prefer to use something called the benchmark, right? There's a benchmark that serves as a measure, right? That if you reach the benchmark, you would do something. If you don't reach the benchmark, you don't do it. So there are 5 basic benchmarks that most people talk about. The first 3 of these, maximizing profit, minimizing expenses, and maximizing market share, all make perfect sense. Everybody should strive to do those things. The challenges with those are, though, it is very difficult to use them in a technique, to use them as a variable with which to make decisions on. And the one that confuses people most is profit. Profit is a good thing. You obviously want to have more profit than less profit. However, using profit as the benchmark in a decision has some issues with that. And we'll talk about that as we go on. The last 2 of these benchmarks, though, let's take the last one first, which is maximizing stakeholder wealth. And we'll talk about stakeholders throughout the course, but essentially this is anyone that has an economic connection to the corporation. It's very difficult to see how we could maximize all shareholder wealth. There's many different agendas, many different contracts. It's just very difficult to see how that might all fit together. So what's left within is the 4th one there, which is maximizing share price. And with respect to that, I guess we just need to ask the question, which is, what is it that the owners of a corporation want? What do they want the managers of the company? What do they expect from your work that you do for the company? And of course, they want to see their stock price go up. They want their wealth to increase. So maximizing the share price is likewise maximizing shareholder wealth. And in the end, that's what the owners of a corporation want. So what is this thing about profit? Why doesn't profit seem to fit? Well, here we have 2 different projects. They have very similar cash flows. This rotor project, it's $1.50, $1.40, and the valve is $60, $1, and then $1.40. So if you add those all up, earnings per share, the rotor has less earnings per share than the valve. It's less profitable. But the problem with this is that most of this profit from the valve happens in later years. And we're going to talk about it in chapters 4 and 5. We're going to talk about what's referred to as the time value of money. And that is that money loses value. So profit maximization might not lead to the highest possible share price. The reasons for that? Timing. Bigger numbers in the beginning are better than towards the end. Profits, as we talked about a little bit earlier, don't necessarily result in cash flows. And quite frankly, this profit number itself doesn't take into account the risk of the project. So profit maximization is very important. We want to strive to increase profits. However, using that as a goal has some challenges that we have to be aware of. Because maximizing shareholder wealth properly considers cash flows, we ultimately can use this in our valuation of stock. A very simple formula to find share price is you take future dividends and divide it by the required return of the stock. The future dividends takes into account the level and timing of cash flows, and the required return incorporates the riskiness of those cash flows. Now, obviously, this is the first chapter. We haven't put these concepts in place yet, but I think you can see if you want to make the share price go up, you need to either increase the future dividends or you need to decrease the riskiness of the cash flows. We had mentioned stakeholders and the stakeholder focus, if you will. Again, this is really geared towards socially responsible management, ethical behavior by management, and that is not doing things that will have a direct economic harm, if you will, to these particular investors, shareholders, employees, the suppliers, the creditors of the company, right? So stakeholders are very important, but again, we want to focus on the stock price, not necessarily on all of the stakeholders. If you've been in business at all within the last 10, 15 years, you've heard of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And quite frankly, the only thing I'm really interested in us understanding here is that this has come about because of lacks of transparency and poor accounting controls. So the idea or the focus of Sarbanes-Oxley is to strengthen the protection against accounting fraud, financial malpractice. As with most legislation, it's not cheap. So we have lost some companies. Some companies have gone to outside the United States. Some of them have actually gone private. So now they don't have to report any financial statements at all. And of course, each of those has its own pluses and minuses, if you will. But the financial statements that we see now should be better, higher quality, more informative types of statements. So let's talk a little bit about ethics. Essentially, what I want to try to get across is that ethics are extremely important. I mean, not just from the fact that it's the Christian, the moral thing to do, but ethics creates an understanding. It creates an environment where everybody can understand what's happening to them. And when you violate those standards, you create the negative publicity. You create either from customers, from creditors, etc., but you create this negative vibe that ultimately falls into the stock price, right? I mean, we're going to want to, if we are ethical, we should be able to reduce litigation. We should have a positive corporate image. We should have shareholder confidence, right? We should be able to have loyal and have loyalty and respect, excuse me, of all of our stakeholders. And in the end, essentially, it's just the golden rule. Don't do something to somebody that you wouldn't want to have done to yourself. Next, we want to talk about corporate governance. So what is corporate governance? Basically, it's the rules, right? When a corporation is created, it signs in to some state, it certifies, if you will, and it creates what's called a corporate charter. And in that charter, it outlines the rights and responsibilities of all of the participants in the game. It talks about the shareholders and the board of directors, the officers, managers, etc. but it sets up the guidelines of the rules. So who cares about the rules? Well, individual investors are obviously those investors who are not tied to a financial institution. They really don't own that much of corporations, quite frankly, anymore. Currently, institutional investors, such as banks, insurance companies, mutual funds, and pension funds, have huge quantities of securities. And unlike individual investors, institutional investors very closely monitor corporate governance. They very closely monitor the actions and the outcomes of the management's decisions in running their company. Now, that wasn't the way it was historically, but over time, this movement to more institutional investors has been very beneficial to individuals, because now corporations answer to these big money people. And of course, individual investors are there along for the ride. So the benefits that go to institutional investors are ultimately enjoyed by the individual investors. There is a challenge, though, in running businesses, and that's something referred to as the agency issue. The principal agency issue basically is this. Managers are hired by owners. The owners of a company, the shareholders, are the principals, and management are the agents. They're there to act in the best interest of principals. Problems arise when managers have goals that don't line up with shareholders. And frequently we want to try to control those. And when we try to control them, there is a cost. So the ultimate agency problem is that we have to spend money to control the actions of managers so that we minimize the losses to shareholder wealth from their actions. So how does this happen? Whenever a manager owns less than 100% of the firm's equity, agency can exist. In theory, managers would agree to shareholder maximization. They understand that. However, they also have personal concerns. They're worried about their job security, their personal wealth, their lifestyle. And this conflict, this additional set of part of their agenda, if you will, is what ultimately causes this conflict between owners and managers. So how can we get managers to act more like shareholders? Well, there's several things. We can use the labor market. If you fire a manager, you would think if they can't get the job done after they've been fired 1, 2, maybe 3 times, it's going to be difficult for them to get employment anymore, or at least get paid what they think they might be worth. Likewise with the takeovers, if management can't keep the stock price rising, then people come over and take over the company. And I'm sure you're familiar with what happens to the management teams of merged companies. The company that's taken over, typically that management team loses their job. So again, managers are going to strive to keep the stock price high. So number one, they don't get fired, and number two, they won't be a takeover target. Auditing the company's books, essentially the efficient use of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act will help us give some transparency so we can see exactly what managers are doing. And finally, why don't we just pay them so that they act like owners? How would we do that, right? How should you pay the employees of a company so they exactly act like owners? Well, the answer to this is very extreme. That is, we should pay them with stock and stock only. So when you go and get your paycheck at the end of the month, you go in and you open your envelope and you've got 50 or 60 shares of stock. And of course, nobody wants to work for stock because you have to convert it to cash. But we do have things called stock options. And an option is the right to buy a stock at a certain price within a certain period of time. This creates two places for the companies to acquire company stock. They can either buy it at the stock market or they can buy it from the company using this piece of paper. So if you have an option to buy a share of stock at $50 and the current price is $35, which place would you go to buy the stock? Would you buy it from the stock market for $35 or from the company for $50? And of course, you would buy it from the stock market. But if management's doing the right things and they're maximizing shareholder wealth, the stock price should rise. So eventually maybe the stock price is at 65 and the managers want to buy some stock. So they can either pay 65 to the stock market or they could pay 50 to the company. And of course, in this case, they pay 50 to the company. And of course, they would sell it immediately in the marketplace and make $15 per share. So using options, and there's other reasons for options besides this, but using options can force managers to think more about their personal wealth and combining that with shareholder wealth. One of the things that I find very confusing in the world, and I'm still waiting for somebody to kind of explain how these things all work, and this just comes from Forbes and talks about the connection between CEO performance and pay. And really, I just want to point out some contradictions here that I find, quite frankly, pretty amazing. Right? Here are the companies, as far as compensation for these particular companies. The highest paid executive is for Oracle Company, Larry Ellison. He was paid $96.2 million, and his stock return was 99th. He actually lost 22%. If we go down here, we'll find Joe Donahue for eBay. Now, his compensation was a third of what that was, and his stock prices actually return was up 68%. How do we reconcile some of these irregularities? And it's something that the financial world is working on right now. That there's issues with executive compensation. How do they get paid? How do we determine what they get paid? And I think most of us would agree if you're running a big company, you should get paid a fair sum of money. But there should be some connection between the job you're doing and the compensation that you get. So, again, that's the end of chapter 1. Just leave you with a little thing to make you stay up at night and think about. That's the end of chapter 1.